The sun was setting over the quiet suburban neighborhood of Oakwood Estates, casting long shadows across manicured lawns and pristine driveways. In the midst of this tranquility, Mason Hale stood on his porch, arms crossed, watching as his trash can was once again knocked over. This wasn't the first time. For weeks, every trash day had been met with the same disrespectful act. But today, Mason had had enough. He wasn't going to let this petty harassment slide any longer. Mason had moved into Oakwood Estates with his wife, Tasha, and their 2 children, seeking a fresh start in a peaceful community. The neighborhood was predominantly white, and Mason, a black man, had hoped that his family would be welcomed with open arms. However, from the moment they arrived, things felt off. Neighbors would wave, but the smiles never reached their eyes. Conversations were short, and invitations to join community events were non-existent. The tipping point came when Mason noticed his trash can had been knocked over again. He had placed it at the curb the night before, as per the HOA guidelines. But every morning it was found tipped over, its contents spilled across the driveway. At first, he thought it was a coincidence. But when it happened week after week, he realized it was deliberate. One morning, Mason decided to confront the person responsible. He stood by his trash can, waiting. Sure enough, a neighbor's SUV drove by and swerved just enough to clip the can, sending it tumbling. Mason's heart raced as he recognized the driver, Barbara Whitman, the president of the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association. Barbara had always been cordial, but Mason had noticed her coldness toward him and his family. Now, seeing her deliberately knock over his trash can, the motive became clear. This wasn't just a random act of vandalism. It was a targeted attempt to intimidate him. As Barbara drove off, Mason stood frozen, a mix of anger and disbelief washing over him. He had been patient. He had tried to fit in, but this was too much. He wasn't going to let her get away with this. He needed to send a message, not just to Barbara, but to the entire neighborhood. That evening, Mason sat down at his desk and began to plan. He wasn't just going to replace his trash can. He was going to install one that Barbara would never see coming. A concrete trash can, heavy and immovable, one that would withstand any attempt to knock it over. It was a small act, but it would send a powerful message. He wasn't going to be intimidated. The next morning, Mason went to the local hardware store and purchased the materials. He spent the afternoon constructing the concrete trash can in his garage, pouring the mixture into a mold and allowing it to set. When it was ready, he placed it at the curb, right where his old trash can had been. The following trash day, Barbara drove by. She swerved, just as she had before, but this time, her SUV collided with the concrete trash can. The impact was loud, and the front of her vehicle was damaged. Barbara slammed on the brakes, her face contorted in shock and anger. She got out of the car, inspecting the damage, and then turned to look at Mason, who was standing on his porch, arms crossed, watching her. Barbara's face turned red with fury. "What the hell is this?" she shouted. Mason remained calm, his voice steady. "Just a little something I thought you might appreciate," he said. Barbara seethed, her fists clenched at her sides. "You think this is funny?" "Not funny," Mason replied. "Just a reminder that I won't be pushed around." Barbara glared at him for a moment longer before getting back into her SUV and driving off, her vehicle limping with the damage. Mason watched her leave, a sense of satisfaction settling over him. He had taken a stand, and it felt good. But this was just the beginning. Barbara wouldn't let this go easily. She would retaliate, and Mason needed to be ready. She had sent a message, but now he had to prepare for the fallout. As the days passed, Mason noticed more subtle signs of Barbara's retaliation. His lawn was inspected more frequently, and he received notices about minor infractions. It was clear that Barbara was using her position to make his life difficult, but Mason wasn't backing down. One evening, as he sat on his porch, he saw Barbara walking up his driveway. She had a clipboard in hand and a smug expression on her face. Mason stood up, ready for whatever she had planned. "Mason," Barbara said, her tone dripping with false sweetness, "I just wanted to remind you about the HOA guidelines. I'm aware of the guidelines, Mason replied, his voice steady. Well, Barbara continued, it seems there's been a complaint about your trash can. Mason raised an eyebrow. A complaint? Yes, Barbara said, her smile widening. Apparently, it's an eyesore. Mason chuckled. Funny, he said. I don't recall seeing any complaints about the other eyesores around here. Barbara's smile faltered, but she quickly recovered. Well, just make sure it doesn't become an issue, she said curtly before turning and walking away. Mason watched her leave, a sense of determination building within him. He had taken a stand, and he wasn't going to let Barbara or anyone else push him around. He would continue to fight for his dignity and his family's place in the community. But as the days went on, the tension between Mason and Barbara escalated. Barbara began to use her position to launch more aggressive attacks against him, citing minor infractions and issuing fines. Mason knew he had to do something more than just stand his ground. He needed to expose Barbara for what she truly was, a bully abusing her power. One evening, Mason sat down at his computer and began to research the HOA's bylaws and regulations. He discovered that Barbara had been selectively enforcing rules, targeting certain residents while ignoring violations from others. Armed with this information, Mason began to document every instance of unfair treatment, taking photographs and keeping detailed records. The next HOA meeting was approaching, and Mason knew it was his chance to confront Barbara publicly. He gathered his evidence and prepared his speech, determined to expose the truth. On the day of the meeting, Mason arrived early, his heart pounding with anticipation. He took a seat at the back of the room, his eyes scanning the crowd. Barbara was already at the front, speaking with other board members. When she saw Mason, her expression soured, but she said nothing. The meeting began, and one by one, residents voiced their concerns. When it was Mason's turn, he stood up, his voice steady but firm. I have evidence, he said, that the HOA president has been selectively enforcing rules and targeting certain residents. A murmur ran through the room as Mason presented his evidence, photographs, records, and testimonies from other residents who had been unfairly treated. Barbara's face turned pale as the room turned against her. This is an abuse of power, Mason continued, and it needs to stop. The board members exchanged uneasy glances, and after a tense silence, they voted to remove Barbara from her position as HOA president. The room erupted in applause as Mason took his seat, his heart swelling with pride. Mason Hale had always believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt. He wasn't quick to judge. He liked to think that his calm demeanor and easygoing nature could bridge gaps, even in a neighborhood like Oakwood Estates. But as the days turned into weeks, that optimism was tested like never before. Before Oakwood Estates, Mason had lived in a bustling city apartment, surrounded by neighbors who barely acknowledged each other. Here, in this pristine suburban enclave, everything looked perfect. The manicured lawns, the white picket fences, the sparkling streetlights that lined every corner. Yet, perfection often had a dark side. The first incident with the trash can had seemed minor at the time. Mason had simply gone outside to find his bin tipped over, garbage spilling onto the curb. Okay, he had muttered to himself, brushing it off. Maybe a raccoon got in there. But when it happened again and again, the reality became impossible to ignore. The first week he had tried reasoning with Barbara Whitman, politely asking if she had seen anyone messing with his trash. She had smiled tightly, shaking her head, as if Mason were imagining things. That smile, Mason now realized, wasn't just polite, it was calculating. Mason and Tasha had moved here for their 2 kids, Jordan and Layla, hoping for a safe environment and a sense of community. The neighborhood promised block parties, pool days, and kids riding bikes safely down quiet streets. But for Mason, it was becoming a daily struggle just to assert a basic right, to live in peace without harassment. It was a Friday evening when the first real confrontation occurred. Mason had been outside, watering his front lawn, when he spotted Barbara walking briskly down the street. She had her usual clipboard, which Mason had come to recognize as the tool of subtle intimidation. It wasn't the kind of clipboard that merely held papers. It was the kind that represented authority, the kind that could threaten fines, citations, or complaints for the most arbitrary of reasons. Barbara stopped near Mason's driveway, the corners of her mouth tight. "Mason," she began, her voice syrupy sweet. "I see your trash can is out of place again." Mason's jaw tightened. "It's exactly where the guidelines say it should be," he replied. "I placed it at the curb last night. That's all." Barbara arched an eyebrow, leaning slightly toward him. "Well, we've had a complaint." Mason raised his hands in mock surrender. "A complaint from whom?" Barbara didn't answer immediately. Instead, she shifted her weight, glanced around as if the neighbors were silently judging him, then tapped the clipboard with her pen. "Some of the residents feel it's unsightly. You understand, right?" Mason's blood boiled. He forced himself to stay calm. "Unsightly? You're saying my trash can is unsightly? Yet the neighbors own bins, cars, and garden gnomes go unnoticed? I don't think it's about looks." Barbara's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, enough for Mason to notice, and then she masked it. "I'm just doing my job," she said, her tone clipped. "You wouldn't want the HOA to think you're disregarding the rules, would you?" Mason nodded slowly, keeping his tone even. "Of course, I want to follow the rules. That's why I'm asking you to stop harassing me. Because this," he gestured toward the tipped-over trash can just a few feet from them. "This isn't about rules. It's about intimidation." Barbara's eyes narrowed. "I assure you, it's nothing personal." But Mason knew better. He could feel the underlying hostility radiating from her. Every smirk, every glance, every dismissive comment over the weeks had a pattern. It wasn't just petty. It was deliberate. After Barbara walked away, Mason went back inside, tension coiling in his chest like a spring ready to snap. He told Tasha what had happened. She listened quietly, then hugged him tightly. "You've been so patient," she said. "Maybe it's time to take control instead of letting this fester." And that's when the idea of the concrete trash can first took shape in Mason's mind. Not out of malice, but out of a desire to reclaim his space and assert that he wasn't someone to be bullied. Over the next few days, Mason began quietly observing Barbara's routine. He noted the times she walked the neighborhood, when her SUV would pass by, and the subtle signs of her scrutiny. Every knock of his trash can, every whispered comment, every judgmental glance, it all added up. Mason started keeping a journal, logging each incident with dates, times, and photographic evidence. He didn't want to overreact, but he wanted proof. Then came the second confrontation. This one was less about words and more about power. Mason had installed a small camera on his porch, a subtle device that blended into the exterior trim. On a sunny Saturday morning, he spotted Barbara approaching. Her eyes scanned the neighborhood like a hawk, stopping briefly at each mailbox, each lawn decoration. Then she reached his trash can and, without hesitation, nudged it forcefully with her foot. Mason felt his hands clench. He stepped outside. "Barbara!" he shouted. Barbara jumped slightly but didn't look guilty. Instead, she smirked. "Morning, Mason. Just making sure your trash can is in its proper place." Mason took a deep breath, trying to regulate the anger that surged through him. "That's enough. I've asked you nicely before. Leave my trash can alone." Barbara's smirk widened. "Nice? You think a simple ask is going to change anything? Rules are rules." Mason stepped closer, his voice calm but firm. "This isn't about rules. You're harassing me, and I won't tolerate it anymore." Barbara laughed lightly, a sound Mason felt in his bones as a warning. "We'll see about that." She turned and walked away, leaving Mason standing there, frustrated but resolute. That night, Mason and Tasha sat down and discussed their options. Going to the HOA had been tried, and Barbara's charm had ensured the board rarely questioned her. Confrontation one-on-one hadn't worked either. What was left? Mason's mind kept returning to one thing: permanence. A solution that couldn't be tipped over, couldn't be moved, and couldn't be ignored. It was a physical statement of his right to exist without fear, a symbol of dignity and empowerment. And it had to be something Barbara would never expect: a concrete trash can. As Mason sketched the design that evening, the weight of weeks of intimidation settled on his shoulders. But with each line he drew, He felt a spark of hope. This wasn't just about a trash can. It was about asserting himself, reclaiming respect, and standing up against bullying disguised as authority. The following days became a calculated operation. Mason researched materials, consulted tutorials, and mapped out the exact dimensions so it would be both functional and unmovable. Tasha helped, providing ideas to make it discreet yet sturdy. The children were oblivious to the plan, seeing only the fun of helping Dad with a project. By the end of the week, Mason had gathered everything: cement, molds, reinforcing materials. He began the labor-intensive task of creating the trash can, carefully pouring layers and letting each cure properly. Sweat dripped down his forehead, but he didn't mind. Each bead of effort was a step toward empowerment, a step toward justice. And as the concrete set, Mason could feel the anticipation building. He knew Barbara would return, and when she did, she would be met with something she never saw coming. Something that would flip the power dynamic, if only slightly, in his favor. Because this wasn't just about trash. This was about dignity. And Mason Hale was done being disrespected. The neighborhood had always seemed calm, almost deceptively serene. But for Mason Hale, peace was now a fragile illusion. After weeks of harassment and the tense confrontations with Barbara, the atmosphere in Oakwood Estates felt charged, like a storm just waiting to break. Every lawn, mailbox, and driveway had become a stage for silent battles, and Mason was no longer willing to be a passive player. It all escalated one Monday morning. Mason had woken early, the sun barely peeking over the horizon, and stepped outside to check his new concrete trash can. It stood solid and immovable at the curb, a testament to his planning and persistence. The weight of it seemed to radiate strength, almost daring Barbara or anyone else to test it. And tested, she did. By 7:30 a.m., Barbara's SUV rolled down the street, the engine humming with the faint sound of country music from her radio. Mason noticed her slowing, as if savoring the moment. And then, her foot nudged the accelerator, causing her car to scrape against the concrete with a metallic thud. Mason winced as he heard the grating sound, but he stayed on his porch, arms crossed, waiting for the inevitable. Barbara got out, her heels clicking against the sidewalk, her face contorted with a mix of fury and disbelief. "What is this?" she shouted, scanning the concrete monstrosity she had clearly underestimated. Mason stayed calm, but his voice carried a sharp edge. "It's exactly what you didn't see coming." Barbara's lips pressed together. "You can't just do this." "Oh, I think I can," Mason replied. "I'm within the guidelines. It's my property, and I'm not going to be intimidated anymore." Barbara glared, clearly struggling to regain her composure. But instead of walking away, she turned back to her SUV and started taking pictures of the concrete trash can, muttering something under her breath about reporting it to the HOA. Mason knew this wasn't over. It was only escalating. Over the next few days, the harassment took on a more systematic form. Notices appeared in Mason's mailbox, some valid, some clearly exaggerated. One cited him for improper curbside placement, even though he had followed the exact HOA schedule. Another claimed his yard wasn't aesthetically pleasing, despite being immaculately maintained. Each note carried Barbara's signature scrawl, the same smug, authoritarian handwriting that Mason had learned to recognize instantly. He realized she was using her position to create a paper trail, to make it look like he was the problem, even though the real issue was her personal vendetta. And she wasn't just targeting Mason. Other residents who had dared to question her authority quietly shared their stories with him. Anonymous complaints, subtle warnings, a pattern of intimidation. Mason was seeing the full scope of her power. The tension peaked one afternoon when a city inspector arrived unannounced. Mason had been painting his fence when the inspector knocked. "Good afternoon, sir," the man said. "I'm here regarding a complaint about your property." Mason felt his stomach tighten. "A complaint? About what?" "About the trash can," the inspector said. "It's considered a fixed obstruction under local regulations. HOA sent a request to check compliance." Mason tried to remain composed. "This trash can is on my property and fully complies with the HOA rules. It's also my personal property. You can inspect it if needed." But I don't see a violation. The inspector nodded, looking at the solid concrete structure with raised eyebrows. It's certainly permanent, not something you can just move. That's the idea, Mason said, a hint of satisfaction in his voice. It's my right to protect my property. The inspector jotted some notes, but Mason could tell he wasn't entirely convinced. And Mason knew Barbara would be reporting every detail back to the HOA, trying to escalate the situation further. That evening, Mason shared the day's events with Tasha. She's trying to paint me as the problem, he said, frustration lacing his tone. Every move I make, every rule I follow, she twisted into a violation. Tasha put a hand on his shoulder. Then we fight smart, not angry. You've documented everything. We know the truth, and it's time to use it strategically. The following week, Mason attended the HOA's monthly meeting. Barbara, predictably, was at the front, exuding authority and control. She opened the meeting with her usual routine, discussing minor infractions, praising compliant residents, and casually tossing in passive-aggressive comments about the neighborhood standards. When Mason's turn came, he stood, heart racing, but voice steady. I'd like to address a pattern of harassment and selective enforcement by the HOA president, he said. Barbara's eyes flickered, the first sign of unease he had noticed in weeks. Murmurs ran through the room as Mason presented his documented evidence. Photographs of tipped-over trash cans, copies of unfair violation notices, and detailed logs of interactions. He even included accounts from other residents who had quietly expressed concerns about Barbara's behavior. Barbara's smug expression wavered, replaced by a tight-lipped frown. She interjected, "This is exaggerated. These are isolated incidents, not harassment." Mason didn't flinch. "Isolated incidents," he replied. "When multiple residents report the same pattern over months, it's more than isolated. It's a campaign of intimidation." The room grew tense. Other residents nodded quietly, some whispering to each other. Mason could see the shift in perception. Barbara's aura of untouchable authority was cracking. That night, Mason's phone buzzed with messages from neighbors. "Thanks for speaking up." One read. Another said, "We've all been afraid to say anything." Mason realized that Barbara's harassment wasn't just personal. It was systemic. Her influence had silenced others, but his action had begun to break that fear. Still, Barbara wasn't done. Over the next few days, she tried to escalate the matter further, calling in the HOA board, filing complaints, and even threatening legal action for property obstruction. Mason remained calm, knowing he had documented everything meticulously. The tension in the neighborhood was palpable. Every glance from Barbara carried a mix of malice and disbelief, as if she couldn't understand how someone dared to resist her control. One evening, Mason decided it was time to meet with a few key allies in the neighborhood, residents who had quietly been observing Barbara's actions. They gathered in his garage, huddled around the concrete trash can, which now served as a symbol of resistance. "She's gone too far this time," one neighbor said. "Everyone's afraid, but no one's willing to stand up." Mason nodded. Fear isn't going to change anything, but with the right evidence, the truth always comes out. We just need to be strategic. Another neighbor added, "You've already exposed her selectively enforcing rules. If the whole board actually looks at it objectively, she's done." Mason smiled faintly. "That's the plan. This is bigger than one trash can. It's about fairness, dignity, and not letting bullies run unchecked." As the meeting ended and neighbors filed out, Mason looked at the concrete trash can again. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over its solid form. It was more than just a piece of cement, it was a declaration. A quiet, immovable statement that he would no longer be intimidated. But Mason also knew that Barbara would strike back harder. The next confrontation wouldn't be a simple scolding or a paper notice. She had the power of the HOA at her disposal, and she wasn't afraid to use it. The stakes were higher now, and Mason understood that the coming days would test his resolve like never before. Because Barbara wasn't just a neighbor with a grudge. She had the authority to make his life miserable. And Mason Hale was about to show her that no amount of power, influence, or intimidation could break his determination. The battle lines were drawn. The escalation was complete. and the neighborhood was about to witness a clash of wills that would shake Oakwood Estates to its core. The days after the whole meeting were tense, and Mason Hale could feel the weight of anticipation pressing down on him. Oakwood Estates, a neighborhood that had once seemed serene, now felt like a chessboard, and every resident was a piece in Barbara Whitman's game. But Mason had a plan, and it was about to take a turn that no one, especially Barbara, could have predicted. It began on a gray Wednesday morning. Mason had just finished his morning coffee when he noticed a cluster of official-looking envelopes in his mailbox. Normally, these were harmless, routine home notices, or friendly newsletters, but today, they carried a sense of foreboding. He tore open the first one and immediately felt his pulse quicken. The notice was from the HOA board. Barbara had filed multiple complaints. The concrete trash can allegedly violated curbside uniformity regulations. His lawn had supposedly grown inconsistent with community aesthetics, and his driveway had a potential hazard for pedestrians. Mason exhaled slowly. He had anticipated retaliation, but seeing the escalation in writing made it real. Then came the second envelope. It was from the City Code Enforcement Office. They had received a complaint about a permanent obstruction on Mason's property, the concrete trash can. The letter stated they would be conducting an inspection the following day. Mason felt a mix of frustration and resolve. Barbara was trying to leverage every tool in her arsenal, but he had done his homework. He had the whole rules, photographs, witness accounts, and a clear timeline of harassment. That afternoon, Mason shared the news with Tasha. "They're trying to make this about me breaking the rules," he said, pacing the living room. "But it's about harassment, intimidation, and selective enforcement." Tasha nodded, concern etched on her face. "Then let's make it about the truth. Document everything. Prepare for the inspection. Don't let them twist the narrative." Mason spent the evening meticulously reviewing every photo, note, and interaction with Barbara. He created a detailed timeline, marking every incident, every threat, every intimidation tactic. By the time he went to bed, the plan was clear. He wouldn't just defend himself. He would expose Barbara for what she truly was. The next morning, city inspectors arrived punctually at 9 a.m. Mason greeted them with a calm smile. Two men in uniform, clipboards in hand, examined the concrete trash can with visible curiosity. "We've had a complaint about a permanent obstruction," one of them said. Mason nodded. "It's my personal property, placed within HOA guidelines. I can show you the documentation and measurements if needed." They began inspecting, measuring the distance from the curb, evaluating visibility for pedestrians, and noting structural integrity. Mason calmly answered every question, showing that the trash can was safe, compliant, and most importantly, a lawful assertion of his property rights. Barbara appeared mid-inspection, striding up with her clipboard in hand, her heels clicking like a drumbeat of authority. "Mason," she said, her voice sharp, "I trust you understand that this may result in penalties if found non-compliant." Mason met her gaze evenly. "I understand the rules. I've followed them exactly. This isn't about compliance. It's about harassment, which I have documented extensively." Barbara's eyes flickered, irritation breaking through her composed exterior. She tried to interject, but the inspectors held up their hands. "We're here to assess compliance, ma'am. Please wait while we complete the inspection." As the inspectors worked, Mason noticed something remarkable. Neighbors began stepping outside, subtly observing the scene. They had seen Barbara's harassment over the weeks, and now they were witnesses. Some nodded at Mason with quiet approval. Others whispered among themselves, clearly impressed by his calm and methodical approach. By noon, the inspection concluded. The inspectors spoke quietly with Mason. "Everything seems compliant," one of them said. "Nothing here violates city codes or safety regulations." Mason felt a surge of relief, but he knew Barbara would not accept this outcome quietly. And he was right. That evening, Barbara called an emergency HOA meeting, citing ongoing violations and neighborhood unrest. Mason anticipated it, having prepared evidence, witnesses, and a carefully crafted statement. The meeting was packed. Residents murmured as Barbara presented her case, painting Mason as a troublemaker disrupting community harmony. She wielded her authority like a weapon, hoping to sway the board and intimidate the neighborhood. But Mason stayed seated, calm and composed, waiting for his moment. When it was his turn, he stood, holding his timeline and photographic evidence. "Barbara," he began, voice steady and commanding, "this is not about aesthetics, compliance, or community harmony. This is about harassment. For weeks, I have been targeted with selective enforcement, intimidation, and threats disguised as rules." He laid out the entire timeline: the tipped-over trash cans, the selective citations, the neighborhood complaints that Barbara ignored, the intimidation tactics during home meetings, and even the city inspection. Each point was backed with clear evidence. The room grew quiet. Board members exchanged uneasy glances. Barbara tried to interrupt, but Mason continued, unwavering. "I've documented everything. I have witnesses, and the city has confirmed that my property is compliant. This isn't a debate about rules. It's about accountability." One by one, other residents spoke up. "I've seen her target Mason unfairly," said a neighbor quietly. "And she does it to others too. It's not just about rules. It's personal." The weight of collective testimony shifted the power dynamics. Barbara, who had once wielded authority like an impenetrable shield, now found herself facing the undeniable truth. Her smirk faltered, replaced by a rigid tension that Mason had never seen before. After hours of testimony, discussions, and deliberation, the board reached a decision. Barbara would be removed from her position as HOA president, effective immediately. Any complaints she had filed against Mason were dismissed, and the board issued a formal warning against selective enforcement of rules. The room erupted in applause. Mason felt a mixture of relief, vindication, and empowerment. He had stood firm, documented the truth, and used logic and evidence to counter bullying disguised as authority. Barbara stormed out, muttering under her breath, her authority shattered. Mason watched, chest swelling, as she disappeared down the street. He felt no joy in her humiliation, only the satisfaction of justice served. Later that evening, Mason and Tasha sat on the porch, the sunset casting a warm glow over the concrete trash can. "We did it," Tasha said softly, leaning against him. "We did," Mason agreed. "But this isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's ever been bullied, intimidated, or silenced. This is proof that standing up, documenting the truth, and staying calm can change the narrative." Mason looked at the neighborhood around him. Oakwood Estates would never be the same. Barbara's reign of intimidation had ended, and a new sense of empowerment was taking root, not just in him, but in everyone who had witnessed the courage it took to confront injustice. But Mason also knew that this was not the end of challenges. Power dynamics rarely shift without resistance, and Barbara might return with new tactics. He had won this battle, but the war for respect, fairness, and dignity was ongoing. As night fell, Mason felt a profound sense of purpose. He wasn't just defending his trash can. He was defending his family, his community, and the principle that no one should be bullied into submission. And for the first time in weeks, he slept with a sense of peace, knowing that the major turning point had been reached, but also aware that the true test of resolve and empowerment was yet to come. After Barbara Whitman's dramatic removal from the whole presidency, one might think the storm had passed. But Mason Hale knew better. Power, even when stripped from a title, rarely disappeared quietly. Barbara still had influence, allies among a few stubborn residents, and a desire to assert control. Oakwood Estates was far from peaceful. The confrontation, Mason realized, was only entering a new phase. The days following the HOA decision were a mix of relief and tension. Mason and Tasha could finally breathe, but every neighbor interaction carried the faint scent of suspicion. Some residents, emboldened by his courage, gave him approving nods. Others, perhaps afraid of reprisal, avoided eye contact entirely. Mason understood their caution. Barbara's reputation as a manipulator had left its mark. One evening, Mason called a meeting in his garage with a small group of neighbors who had quietly supported him. The space smelled faintly of sawdust and concrete dust, remnants from the project that had started this saga. He laid out his plan. The goal wasn't to antagonize Barbara further, but to protect his family, assert boundaries, and ensure that the HOA and remaining allies couldn't manipulate the rules again. "We need to be proactive," Mason began, his voice steady. "It's not enough that Barbara is gone. We have to make sure no one else can weaponize the rules like she did." One neighbor, Mr. Patel, adjusted his glasses nervously. "Are we talking about more documentation? Security cameras? Legal steps?" "Exactly," Mason replied. "Cameras are already up, documenting activity around the property. We're keeping logs of any HOA notices or complaints, with dates and evidence. And if anything escalates legally, we'll be ready to present everything clearly." Tasha, standing nearby, added, "It's about creating a system where intimidation fails because the truth is undeniable." The small group nodded, the air thick with a shared determination. They weren't just protecting Mason, they were building a shield for the entire neighborhood. That same week, Mason noticed subtle signs that Barbara wasn't done. She would drive past his house slowly, muttering under her breath, or peer over fences with a scowl. Mason recorded everything. He knew that patience and precision were more powerful than anger. Each photo, each note, each timestamp was another layer of armor. The tension reached a peak one Saturday morning. Mason had stepped out to retrieve the mail when he noticed a flyer stuck to his front door. It read, "Neighborhood Standards Committee meeting. All residents must attend." It was official looking, but Mason immediately suspected Barbara's hand in orchestrating it. She had tried to use the HOA previously to rally support for her grievances, and this seemed like a continuation. He grabbed the flyer, reading it carefully. The meeting was scheduled for the following evening, and it threatened potential fines and penalties for non-compliance with aesthetic rules, vaguely referencing the concrete trash can. Mason felt a familiar rush of adrenaline, not fear, but readiness. He had anticipated this. That night, he and Tasha prepared. They reviewed all evidence, photos, and logs, arranging them into a presentation format. Mason's garage transformed into a strategic command center, binders stacked neatly, a laptop ready for projections, and even a few neighbors who had agreed to testify as witnesses. They weren't just going to respond, they were going to control the narrative. The next day, Mason rehearsed his delivery. He paced the living room, speaking aloud, refining his words. "This is about transparency, fairness, and accountability," he practiced. "We follow the rules, yes, but harassment and selective enforcement will not be tolerated. My family and I, and others, have suffered under biased actions, and it's time the HOA is held accountable for fair governance." Tasha listened, nodding. "Keep it clear and factual. Emotional, yes, but measured. Let the evidence speak louder than anger." By evening, the neighborhood hall was packed. Residents murmured among themselves as the board called the meeting to order. Mason arrived early, carrying his binders and laptop. He felt the familiar mix of nerves and determination. Barbara entered soon after, dressed impeccably, clipboard in hand, exuding confidence and authority as if nothing had changed. Mason noticed the glances exchanged between Barbara and a few remaining board members. They looked uncertain now, aware that Mason's preparation could expose more than just a single concrete trash can dispute. Barbara opened the meeting with her usual flourish. "Tonight, we will discuss ongoing concerns regarding neighborhood aesthetics and compliance," she announced, her tone clipped but rehearsed. "Certain residents have made choices that do not align with community standards." She glanced directly at Mason, as if daring him to respond. When the floor opened to residents, Mason stepped forward, feeling the weight of months of tension settle on his shoulders. "I'd like to address the narrative being presented," he said, voice clear and commanding. He clicked the laptop, projecting a timeline of events, photos of tipped-over trash cans, copies of unfair fines, and documentation of selective enforcement. The room grew quiet. Barbara's smirk faltered slightly as Mason systematically explained each incident, connecting her actions to a pattern of intimidation. "This isn't about rules," Mason said firmly. "This is about harassment. Residents have been targeted personally, fines issued selectively, and complaints manufactured to maintain control. I have evidence of every instance. One by one, neighbors spoke up, sharing brief accounts of Barbara's tactics. Each story reinforced Mason's argument. Board members whispered to each other, realizing the scale of the issue and the credibility of the evidence. Barbara's confident posture began to crumble. Then Mason reached the moment he had been waiting for, the culmination of weeks of careful planning. He presented the city inspection report, showing that the concrete trash can was entirely compliant. "The city has confirmed," he said, "that my property is fully within regulations. Any claims to the contrary are false and intended to intimidate." Barbara's face turned red with anger. She attempted to interject, but Mason held up a hand, voice unwavering. "Please, let the facts speak for themselves." The tension in the room was palpable. Board members exchanged glances. Residents leaned forward in anticipation. And Barbara, realizing her authority had eroded completely, slumped slightly in her chair, muttering under her breath. Mason concluded with a statement that resonated beyond the immediate conflict. "This isn't just about a trash can or a few fines," he said. "It's about fairness, respect, and ensuring that no resident lives in fear of personal harassment disguised as authority. We are stronger when truth, evidence, and integrity guide our actions." A hush fell over the room. Then, slowly, a few residents applauded. One by one, others joined in, the sound swelling like a wave of validation and support. Mason felt the energy shift. Barbara's influence had been neutralized, and the community's collective voice was reclaiming power. After the meeting, Mason and Tasha walked home, the streets of Oakwood Estates quieter than usual, but with a sense of renewed possibility. They knew this wasn't the end. Barbara might try to rebuild influence, and others might test boundaries in the future. But for the first time in weeks, Mason felt in control. He looked at the concrete trash can, still solid and unmoved by past attempts at harassment. It wasn't just a physical object. It was a symbol of resistance, of dignity, and of careful preparation. And as Mason considered the months ahead, he understood a critical truth. Confrontation wasn't just about standing your ground. It was about planning, strategy, and the courage to enforce fairness when others sought to bend rules for personal gain. The showdown was approaching, and Mason was ready. The morning of the final confrontation arrived like a storm on the horizon. Mason Hale felt a familiar mix of nerves and determination as he stepped outside. Sunlight glinting off the concrete trash can that had become both a symbol and a shield. Oakwood Estate seemed quieter than usual, almost anticipating what was about to unfold. Mason could feel the tension in the air, neighbors glancing from windows, murmuring among themselves, waiting to see the showdown that had been building for months. Barbara Whitman arrived punctually, as if she had rehearsed this moment her entire life. Her heels clicked against the pavement, the sharp sound cutting through the morning stillness. Her face was carefully composed, but Mason noticed the subtle tension in her jaw and the slight twitch in her brow. This was the same woman who had once wielded authority like a weapon, but now, something had shifted. She was facing a reality she hadn't anticipated. A neighbor who would not be intimidated, a community quietly observing, and the undeniable weight of evidence stacked against her. "Good morning, Mason," Barbara said, her voice tight, but still dripping with false sweetness. "I see you're continuing with that project of yours." Mason didn't flinch. He crossed his arms, standing tall. "I'm maintaining my property within all HOA and city guidelines. This isn't a project. It's a lawful assertion of my rights." Barbara's eyes narrowed. "We'll see what the board thinks. I've called an emergency session. They'll want to address all these concerns." "Concerns?" Mason echoed, voice steady. "You mean harassment and selective enforcement. That's what you want to call it." Before Barbara could respond, several neighbors stepped onto the sidewalk, carrying their own documents, photographs, and notes. They had been quietly collecting evidence, corroborating Mason's story, and now they were ready to speak. Barbara's composure faltered slightly. She was no longer in a room where she controlled the narrative. She was on the street, surrounded by witnesses who could attest to her pattern of intimidation. The emergency HOA session convened at the community hall later that morning. Residents filled every seat, the air thick with anticipation. Mason set up his laptop and presentation materials, each file meticulously organized. Photographs of tipped-over trash cans, copies of unfair notices, timestamps of every confrontation, and records of city inspections confirming compliance. He was prepared to lay everything bare. Barbara arrived last, trying to command attention. "Let's keep this professional," she said, scanning the room. "We're here to discuss compliance, not personal disputes." Mason stood, taking a deep breath. "This is not personal, Barbara. This is about fairness, transparency, and holding those in power accountable." He clicked the first slide of his presentation, a timeline of events, starting with the initial trash can incident. The audience leaned forward. Each image, each note, each timestamp told the story of months of harassment. Neighbors who had once whispered quietly now stood up to corroborate Mason's account. "I saw her knock over Mason's trash can more than once," said Mrs. Ramirez, a longtime resident. "It wasn't about rules, it was personal." Barbara tried to interrupt, but Mason raised a hand. "Please, let the facts speak." The board members exchanged uneasy glances. They had always relied on Barbara's reports to guide their decisions, but now they faced clear, undeniable evidence that she had abused her position. Mason systematically went through each point, using screenshots, photos, and witness statements. He remained calm, his voice measured, yet firm, each word carrying the weight of truth and preparation. As Mason reached the city inspection report confirming compliance, the room grew tense. Barbara's face flushed with anger. Her arguments faltered under the undeniable evidence. This is not how I intended it to be," she muttered, trying to regain control. But it was too late. The community had seen the truth, and the board could no longer ignore it. One by one, residents voiced their support for Mason. Their testimonies were consistent, factual, and emotionally compelling. The room buzzed with a collective sense of validation. Mason's persistence, documentation, and careful planning had dismantled Barbara's narrative piece by piece. The climax came when the board chair stood, looking directly at Barbara. "Based on the evidence presented, it is clear that harassment and selective enforcement have occurred. Effective immediately, Barbara Whitman is removed from any position of authority within the HOA. Any remaining complaints against Mason Hale are dismissed, and a formal warning is issued regarding future conduct and impartial enforcement of rules." Barbara's face paled. She opened her mouth, then closed it, unable to muster a coherent argument. The room erupted in quiet applause, a mix of relief and empowerment rippling through the neighbors. Mason exhaled, feeling a mixture of triumph and exhaustion. The confrontation had been intense, emotionally charged, and high stakes. Months of intimidation, harassment, and manipulation had culminated in this moment, and justice had prevailed. Outside the community hall, neighbors approached Mason, offering congratulations, shaking hands, and sharing their own stories of quiet intimidation. He realized that this victory wasn't just personal, it was communal. By standing firm, documenting everything, and remaining calm, he had given others the courage to assert their rights as well. Barbara, meanwhile, retreated to her car, muttering to herself. Her authority, carefully cultivated over years, had been dismantled in one decisive confrontation. Mason felt no glee in her defeat, only the satisfaction that fairness and truth had prevailed. Back home, Mason and Tasha stood on their porch, looking at the concrete trash can now bathed in the golden glow of the setting sun. It had stood immovable through the storm, a silent witness to the months of struggle and the ultimate triumph of dignity over intimidation. "This isn't just about the trash can," Mason said softly. "It's about standing up, being prepared, and showing that no one should live in fear of harassment or abuse of power." Tasha nodded. "And it's about community. You didn't just defend yourself, you inspired others to speak up too." Mason smiled, feeling the weight of months of tension lifting. The climax had passed, but he knew the lessons would resonate far beyond this single confrontation. The neighborhood had changed. Residents were more vigilant, more empowered, and more willing to stand up for fairness. As night fell, Mason reflected on the journey. The battles hadn't been easy. There had been threats, intimidation, and moments of doubt. But the truth, combined with preparation, patience, and courage, had triumphed. The concrete trash can was more than just a barrier. It was a symbol of empowerment, resilience, and justice. And while Barbara's shadow still lingered in some corners, Mason knew one thing for certain. He had faced the storm, stood firm, and emerged victorious. The climax had been brutal, tense, and dramatic, but the outcome reinforced a timeless truth. Those who fight for fairness, dignity, and justice, with patience and evidence, cannot be silenced. The morning after the climactic HOA showdown, Oakwood Estates felt different. The streets were the same: manicured lawns, pristine sidewalks, and neat mailboxes. But the air carried a subtle shift, like a calm after a storm. Mason Hale stepped outside, taking in the quiet neighborhood. His concrete trash can gleamed in the soft sunlight, immovable and unyielding, a silent sentinel marking his hard-won victory. But while the immediate battle had been won, Mason knew the war for peace, respect, and dignity in the neighborhood wasn't over. Barbara Whitman's removal from the HOA presidency was decisive, yet her presence lingered, like an uninvited shadow at the edge of every corner. Mason also understood that systemic change wouldn't happen overnight. He and the residents had to maintain vigilance. Neighbors began to approach him gradually, cautiously at first, their faces a mixture of relief and gratitude. Mrs. Ramirez was the first to knock on Mason's door. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said, holding back tears. "I've been afraid to speak up for months. Seeing you stand your ground, it gave me courage." Mason smiled gently. "You don't have to thank me. We did this together." He realized that in many ways, the true victory extended far beyond his own struggle. The neighborhood had witnessed a standard of accountability and fairness they hadn't seen before. Other residents soon followed. Mr. Patel, who had quietly observed Barbara's tactics for months, stopped by with a stack of letters he had compiled documenting similar harassment he had endured. "I didn't know where to turn," he admitted. "But after seeing what you did, I feel like I can finally take action too." Mason nodded. "Keep your records. Document everything. And remember, transparency is your strongest defense." Meanwhile, Barbara's influence was visibly waning. She attempted to rally support among a small faction of loyalists, but the community's mood had shifted. Residents no longer feared her authority. They had witnessed firsthand that evidence, preparation, and calm persistence could neutralize intimidation. Even her remaining allies were hesitant, unsure whether continuing to support her would backfire. At the same time, Mason began receiving messages from other neighborhood associations. Some were sympathetic, offering advice. Others were curious, asking how he had handled harassment and selective enforcement. He realized his story was becoming a quiet beacon of empowerment, proof that standing up for your rights, methodically and calmly, could dismantle entrenched authority. At home, Tasha and Mason discussed the immediate steps they needed to take. "We've won the fight," Tasha said, "but we need to maintain peace." Barbara might try smaller, subtler forms of retaliation. "We have to stay vigilant without escalating," Mason agreed. "That's why documentation remains key. Cameras, logs, neighbors as witnesses. If anything happens, we are ready." He glanced at the concrete trash can, its smooth surface catching the afternoon sunlight. "And this little guy isn't going anywhere." Over the next week, Mason noticed subtle changes in Barbara's behavior. She walked past his house more cautiously, her posture less commanding, her once smug expressions replaced by tight-lipped scowls. She tried to maintain appearances, but her influence had diminished. The board had issued formal guidelines clarifying enforcement procedures, making it impossible for her to manipulate rules without clear consequences. Some residents began to take small, proactive steps. Mailboxes were adjusted to comply with the clarified guidelines. Lawns were maintained with care, but without fear of arbitrary citations. The neighborhood, once tense and divided, began to feel more cohesive. Mason noticed neighbors smiling, waving, and casually stopping to chat, gestures that had been rare during Barbara's tenure. One evening, Mason decided to host a small gathering in his backyard. A few neighbors came by, bringing food and drinks. It was informal, a casual celebration of the regained sense of community. Children played on the lawn, laughing and riding bikes without fear. Mason watched them, a sense of relief washing over him. This was what he had been fighting for: a safe, peaceful environment where intimidation and harassment no longer ruled. During the gathering, Mrs. Ramirez approached Mason quietly. "I know you're a private person," she said, "but your actions change things here. Not just for you, but for all of us." "I can't thank you enough." Mason nodded humbly. "I didn't do it alone. The whole neighborhood played a part. It's proof that when people stand together, change is possible." Even Barbara, now removed from power, remained a presence in the neighborhood, but her tactics had less effect. Mason observed her occasionally peering over fences or muttering to herself, but there was no longer fear, only observation, which carried little weight against the newfound collective awareness of residents. In the days that followed, Mason took time to reflect on the experience. The concrete trash can, which had started as a practical solution to repeated harassment, had become a symbol of resilience, planning, and empowerment. But he also recognized the broader lesson: enduring change required more than a single act of defiance. It required strategy, documentation, and community support. He also noticed a subtle shift in himself. The months of confrontation had forced him to develop patience, precision, and confidence. He was no longer just a neighbor defending a trash can.